All during last year, 2020, in the American presidential campaign, there was an enormous amount of talk by people on all sides of the political divide and by people who were running the actual electoral process on the ground, the people doing the counts and so on, uh, saying how important democracy is, how committed they are to it, and how wonderful it is, how significant that this process is being done with such scrupulousness and the rest. So that degree of commitment to the idea of democracy in the United States was very striking, given, as I say, that it was from every side of the debate. And yet, in the last 4 or 5 years at least, we've been witness to the idea of democracy and the practice of democracy coming under a great deal of pressure. And this is surprising. There seems to be a kind of disconnect here. What's going on? Indeed, if we look at the practice of democracy, go back to 2016 and we see the election of Donald Trump and we see the Brexit referendum, no matter what you think about them, whether you're in favor of Donald Trump and in favor of Brexit or the reverse, you could be a bit surprised or concerned when you notice that Hillary Clinton got over 3 million more votes than Trump did, and yet he was elected president. And in the Brexit referendum, only 37% of the total British electorate voted in favor of leaving the EU, and we have left the EU. So you might raise some questions about whether or not our democracies are functioning. And maybe those people who are critical of it or concerned about it have a point. Well, in this and subsequent talks, I want to dig in a little bit to why it is that indeed there are some problems with democracy. But to characterize that properly, we need first to understand what we mean when we talk about democracy, because it's a very capacious concept. It applies in different ways in different countries, in different systems, and therefore it's important to be clear about it. And one very good, quick way of getting clear about it is to remind ourselves of that famous speech by Abraham Lincoln in November of 1863, halfway through the American Civil War, at Gettysburg, where he defined democracy as government of the people, by the people, for the people. There is no better succinct and actually rather precise account of what democracy is than that. Although, of course, one needs to dig into it because it's a rather heavily freighted definition. Government of the people, yes, that's perfectly straightforward. Government by the people? Well, when Abraham Lincoln uttered those words, the people who had the vote, those who were enfranchised in the states of what came to remain the United States, were white men who owned property. White male property owners were the only people who had the vote. So the concept of the people in that second part of the definition, by the people, was a very restricted one. The people there just referred to those who had been given the franchise. It wasn't until 1919 that women were given the vote in the United States. It wasn't until 1928 that women were given the vote in the United Kingdom on the same basis as men, that is, at the same voting age. So the question of the franchise is an interesting one. Obviously, one would want the franchise to be as extensive and inclusive as possible in order for that phrase, by the people, to have real bite. Now, obviously, you don't give the vote to a newborn baby or perhaps to somebody very, very elderly who may be suffering from some form of dementia, which makes it difficult for them to get information about party policies and to make a good choice at the ballot box. So the franchise is never going to be the population as a whole, but we certainly want it to be as big a slice of the population as possible. So we need to think a little bit about that by the people part. Now, the last part of the definition is for the people. Now, in this part of the definition, the phrase the people means the population as a whole. It means something different from the people in the second part of the definition. And this is a really, really important aspect of the definition. For the people as a whole. Now, if you think about that, if you dwell on that, if you look at the implications of that, you see that immediately it begins to tell you some things about what a democratic government and what a democratic process should really be like. For one thing, if a democratically constituted government is for the people as a whole, then it cannot be just for one part of the people, that is, the people who supported whoever happened to be forming the government at the time. That is, it cannot be partisan or factional. It must be something that really serves the interests of everybody inclusively. And another thought that that generates immediately is that it is a false simplisticism to think that democracy means rule by the majority. You can see that that's not true because minorities and individuals have rights which cannot be overridden by the majority. If 99% of the population just arbitrarily decided that we should hang or kill the remaining 1%, that would be a tremendous violation of the rights of the 1%. And we wouldn't want it to happen, even if the majority were that big. And indeed, when you dig into the concept of a majority, you find that in fact there is no such thing other than as a temporary coalition of minorities relative to some purpose, that different groups of minorities come together to constitute a majority on some issue. This is because societies are very diverse, are very multiple in their character. They are, in fact, sort of great confederations of minorities. And majorities are therefore, as it were, temporary artificial constructs at a moment, on the day of an election or on the day of a referendum. And that's another reason for thinking that in a democracy, for the people must mean everybody. It must range across all these different minorities and all their different interests. So that way of analyzing the idea of democracy shows us that we have to really dig into those processes, those structures, those institutions and ways we do things in democracies to make sure that a democracy is genuinely by the people and for the people. And when we look at some of the leading examples of democracies in our world today, United States, United Kingdom, and indeed over 50 states in the world have democracies which are based on what's called the Westminster model. As that name suggests, it's derived from the parliament that came into existence, the parliamentary tradition that came into existence in England in the late 17th century. And I'm afraid to say there are a number of problems with it, which we need to examine, because it could very well be that the new conditions of our world, with social media, with international pressures and stresses, are making it necessary for us to rethink how we work our democracies and what reforms they might require.